Welcome. We build and deploy web apps for a living. But getting your app to the web is only the first step. Your business needs your app to be fast, secure, scale, and continuously deploy. But where do we begin? I'm John Papa, and let's explore together how we can deploy secure apps that scale. Let's start with a story that many of you are familiar with. You've built an app, and that app connects people who need groceries with those who can provide them. Millions of people could use this now. Let's think about what you need to get it to your users. You wrote your code, and you probably pushed that up to GitHub. So you've got it in source control, and now you intend to set up CI/CD, continuous integration and deployment. And you need your APIs to get to your data, but will they be served on another server? And then if they are, how do you connect those and route your requests from your app to your API securely? Maybe you need something like reverse proxy or CORS. And speaking of security, you definitely want an SSL certificate and a custom domain. And your users must authenticate so you know they are who they say they are. And of course, you might need to define roles for authorization so that you know what they can do and what they can't do. And ultimately, you need your app to reach everyone around the world at global scale. Wow, you just want to publish your app. Now here we might be using something like Angular, but there's other choices as well. We've got React and Svelte and also Vue. These tools have fundamentally changed the way we build web applications. Instead of a server runtime that makes database queries and builds pages dynamically when they're requested, these new JavaScript-powered applications run entirely in the browser. We've moved the application responsibilities from the server entirely into the client. So now there's a build process required. And all of your code for your application has to be built before it's deployed. And what you get out the other end of that is a build process isn't just some static files. We call them static because they don't change. They don't require a web server to build them dynamically like ASP.NET or PHP, etc. In fact, we don't really need much of a web server at all. All we need is to return these files just as they are, our HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's almost a throwback to a time when the web wasn't full of dynamic applications rendered by servers. So again, how do we get there to deploy our Angular applications? These are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript after all. We need a fundamentally new kind of cloud service for these applications. So what do we need? We need to be able to build and host our static web apps, set up security with SSL and authentication and authorization, be able to handle our APIs, possibly powered by serverless technology, and then set up a pipeline for CI and CD, possibly using something like Github Actions. So how does this work? Well, you create your Angular or React or Svelte website, and you end up with your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if you want an API, you can create an API folder in your project and add in some Azure Function endpoints. So you push those up to GitHub. It'll automatically kick off an action inside of GitHub to build your project and deploy it, and then geo-replicate it to regions around the world. And out comes our HTML and JavaScript and CSS, that's our static content, and our APIs if we want to have those for the application. And collectively, these are known as static web apps. And they can reach all the users that we need to. Now let's see how to publish your application. And then we're going to publish the API, and then we'll come back and we'll handle authentication and authorization. But let's start the same place you do, with your code up on GitHub. We'll take a look at the repository called Hello Build. In here, I've got an application that I wrote in Angular, React, Svelte, and Vue. We're going to take a close look at the Svelte version of the app. We want to deploy that to Azure. So we'll go to the portal, and we'll find Static Web Apps, the preview. In the upper left, we'll click on the Add button. Now here, I want to choose a resource group that I've already created called Papa Hello Build. And then I'm going to type the name in that I want to use, which will be Hello Build. And then my region will be West US 2. We authenticate with GitHub, so then we can communicate with our repository. We'll choose the organization of John Papa. And then the repository is going to be Hello Build. And then we'll choose the master branch. Then I'm going to click on the Next Build button. Now here on this page is all the build steps we need to enter, so it knows how to build our application. We have to tell it where is the app located. So the app is in a folder called Svelte app. We just saw that. And then our functions are inside of a folder called functions. That's our API. This final field is where does the Svelte app put its built assets. So after Svelte compiles and puts all of its stuff inside JavaScript and CSS files, where does that get located? That's going to be in a folder called public. So we'll type that in and then click on View and Create. Now here we can review all the settings that we just chose, and then we'll click the blue Create button in the bottom left. Now Azure is going out there to deploy all the resources that we need. And once it's ready, it'll let us know that we can go look at this application, and then it's going to start building our application using Github Actions. Now that we see the Go to Resource button, we can click on that. And up here on this screen, we can see the overview. On the top in the blue bar, it says we can click here to check the status of our GitHub run. We'll do that right now. It flips over to our repository in the Actions tab. Now you can see there's a yellow circle. That means that it's running our action. We can click on that to see what's happening. So our action is queued up, and it also lets us see the workflow file. This is the first time we've seen this because it just got added to our app. Now the workflow file, if we go down to line 27, we can see it says app location is Svelte app. API is functions, and the artifact is public. Those are the same three settings that we just set in Azure. So those were used to fill in the workflow file so it could do this build for us. Now let's go take a look. We've got a Svelte app folder and a functions folder, right? So go back in the code. For the repository, we can see we've got Svelte app right here. And there's our public folder. And if we go back out to the root, we should have a functions folder. Uh-oh, we don't have a functions folder. It's actually called API. The nice thing about this is the GitHub action is going to run, and if it can't find the API, it just won't deploy it. It'll still build the application. So right now we can see that the build worked. We can click on the action, and on the left, click on Build and Deploy Job. Open up the Build and Deploy task here. We scroll to the bottom, and we can see everything was successful. And up here at Lemon Tree, that's our URL, we can go see our app. We can also go back to our portal, and we can see here that the URL is listed in the upper right. We can click on Lemon Tree, and the application should come up. Now, we don't have data, so I would expect that the list and the discounts don't show anything because we didn't connect the functions the proper way. But we're going to fix that in the workflow file. But did we get our SSL? Yes, we did. Up here on the upper left, we can click and see that we have a secure connection, and we've got a certificate. What if we wanted to have a custom domain? Well, let's look at the final version of this app, which I've deployed at www.shopathome.dev. Here we can see we've got our security with SSL certificates all set up with our custom domain. How did I do that? Back in the Azure portal for the Shop at Home app, we can see on the left there's a custom domains menu item. And here it shows shopathome.dev was selected. So how could we do that for our application? Coming back to Hello Build, we can click on Custom Domains. We could choose Add. Then it tells us what we have to configure with our DNS provider. And then second step here is once you've purchased a custom domain, you enter the domain here, validate it, and hit Add. So going back to our application, we know we have to fix the API, but there's one other thing we have to fix. Notice that I'm on the discounts page, and up here in the URL, it says /discounts. Well, there is no server-side file called discounts. So if I refresh, I would expect that it would actually still show the app, and then load the Svelte routes, and then go back to the discounts page. But it's not doing that. It's telling me I've got a 404. Well, we can fix that too because there's a missing fallback route, which a lot of these client-side JavaScript frameworks need. So let's go to VS Code and look at our application. Now, here's the application before we had the workflow file. Now I have to pull from GitHub. Why? Because I want to get that workflow file that was added. It's in the GitHub Workflows folder, and we can see it's right here. And we go scroll down to line 27, and we can see it says Svelte app is the location for the app, and functions is not the name of the folder that we have our API in. So I'm going to change that to API. So line 28 now matches what we can see over here on the left for the API. Now I want to push these changes to GitHub and build them and deploy them, but I don't want to overwrite what's in production. So what I want to do is create a new branch, and we'll call that branch My API. So the change we just made is in this new branch. We want to add one other change. Remember, we want that fallback route. So in the Svelte app, remember everything gets deployed to the public folder. We can right click in there and we can add a file called routes.json. Routes.json is a special file that Azure Static Web Apps looks for so we can control all of our server-side routes. In this case, the route we want to control is if there is an unknown file that's being requested on the server, like we just did on a refresh of our client-side app, for discounts, it should automatically reroute that to the index.html. So all we have to do is tell this file to do that. So what I'm going to do is add a routes array, and in here on line 4, I'm saying if there's any route that's unknown, serve index.html, because that's the page that's going to serve the whole app, and a status code of 200. Now that all that's there, let's go ahead and commit these changes. We'll say fallback route and API, and we'll push this to GitHub. It's going to ask me if there's an upstream branch. Would you like to publish it? I would like to do that, yes. And then let's go back into the browser, back up onto GitHub, and we should be able to see under pull requests that we could create a new one for my API. Let's do that. So we'll create the pull request. And then in a moment, what's going to happen is now that we've got this pull request created, the action is going to kick in and see that, okay, you've got a new branch that you made a pull request with. Let's go create a new build and push it to a staging URL. This is really nice because we can preview the changes from our application. So if we click on the details down here, it'll automatically come over to the Actions tab and open up the build for us. So it's running it. We can also get there by clicking on Actions and then fallback route and API. We can see here that the build and deploy job is still running. So instead of waiting for this one to run, let's go ahead and take a look at the production app again. Here's the production app that we have. I have a staging URL right next to it. My staging URL happens to be running with Vue because I wanted to see what that would look like, but not overwrite the production app. Notice here that I've got this URL, which is the longer name of the URL. It's not my custom domain. And it's got the number of the PR in the URL and the region it was deployed to. That's how you designate the staging or preview URL. If we flip over to its GitHub repo, we can see in the pull request itself that I made here, if I click on the pull request, every time the build has succeeded, you're going to see a comment like this: your staging site is ready. So that's how you can actually get to your application in the staging URL. That's what's showing up here, and that's why we have a list of data. Our API is now connected, so we can get into that. So we built the app and the API and published it to Azure Static Web Apps. And what we got was an application that was deployed at global scale. We got our custom domain and our SSL cert. We have our Azure Functions for API. And we made a pull request that then built the action and created a staging URL. So now we can keep our custom domain up there with our production site, and we can have a staging URL for looking at any changes we want to make. Now let's go set up authentication and authorization for the application. We're back in VS Code, and we're going to establish authentication first. Authentication verifies you are who you say you are. So let's set that up first. Now out of the box, Azure Static Web Apps allows 5 different authentication providers: Google, Facebook, GitHub, Azure Active Directory, and Twitter. Now they all just work out of the box, but let's say that you want to prevent people from using some of those. Well, we can actually block some of those providers right here in the routes file. So let's go ahead and block a couple of these. We're going to block Facebook and Google just to show you how to do it. Here what we're saying is if you use this authentication provider, it's going to return a 404. Simple enough. So our users will be able to authenticate with Twitter, GitHub, or Azure Active Directory. Now we want to handle authorization in our application. Let's say that we don't want any of the users to be able to see the data unless they're first authenticated. Well, we can do that by setting up some route restrictions. And maybe only the users who have been logged in as preferred users, or maybe there's a role called preferred, will be able to edit our data. So let's set these rules up. Here we have a route that says API discounts is available to anybody with the preferred role. So you can only see the discounts if you signed up and you're in that role. And then we've got routes down here in line 16 where it says anybody who hits the API/X routes, anything underneath that, and we're going to use X for all of our editing of our list. So they can't manipulate their shopping list unless they're also in the preferred role. But we've got the API route down here that says any other route that they go to, like looking at the shopping list, all you have to do is be authenticated. Now, everybody who logs in with any of the authentication providers is automatically in the authenticated role. But we have to set up the preferred role. So first, what we have to do is commit our changes, and we'll push these up to GitHub, and this will cause the workflow to rebuild. But how would we set up one of these roles? Let's go back into Azure and we'll take a look at this. So to set up a role, we can see the Shop at Home app. This is the final version. We can see role management on the left. Here we can see that there's a couple users already inside of our roles. There I am, John Papa, associated with my GitHub authentication provider, and notice I have the preferred role right here. So that will allow me to do all the things inside my application once I'm logged in, as opposed to someone who's just authenticated. Now the way you add people is to click Invite, and you choose the provider, and then you select their user handle, and then you select the domain that they have access to. Could be your production or it could be your staging site. You add the role right here and then give the invitation expiration in hours. Then you can generate that invitation and send that to your user. So let's go take a look at what this does in the app. In the final version of the app, notice that I'm not authenticated. I can't see discounts. I can't see the list. Nothing's there. Now, I have a link down here for Facebook. Remember, we blocked Facebook. So if I click on that, it's going to go to a page not found. And you can customize this page any way you like. So let's use Twitter here. And if I go to Twitter, it's going to authenticate I am who I say I am. And now I should be able to go look at the list and see my data show up. And there's my shopping list. But remember, the discounts was only for preferred users. With Twitter, I'm not a preferred user. I don't have that authentication provider assigned that role. So let's log out. When I authenticate with GitHub, I am in the preferred role. So I'm going to click on GitHub, and now I can see the discounts, I can see the list, and I could also edit or change my list as well. So we added authentication and authorization to our app by establishing that through the routes JSON. Now, where did we start? Remember, we wrote an app, but we had to worry about all these different concerns. And having a service like Azure Static Web Apps lets us combine all those things into one service that's just easy to use. So we can just focus on building apps. Whether you're using Angular, Svelte, React, or Vue, it's the same process. Now, if you want to try this out for yourself, you can check out these different resources. Now, I encourage you to learn more by clicking on the link here for Learn, where it's a hands-on free tutorial where you can deploy any one of these applications of your chosen framework up to the cloud. Or you can click on the link here where you can get extensive documentation. And if you're using a different framework other than the 4 that I'm showing here, well, if you click on this link for GitHub John Papa Hello Worlds, you'll see over 30 different web frameworks, and you can choose one of those and then deploy it to static web apps. So if you're trying to deploy web applications and get all these enterprise features, give it a try right here. Thanks for coming.